Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Pacific Dental Conference and the CDHBC Dental Hygiene Forum. Before we begin, I would like to say that we are fortunate to meet here today to conduct this important forum from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish traditional territory and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, who have a special relationship with this land since time immemorial. Before I turn the mic over to our board chair, David McPherson, I just also want to recognize some other CDHBC board members in the audience with us today. We have Lise Cavan from Vancouver Island, Ruth Lunn from Vancouver, and Emily Chown, who is one of our public members from Vancouver as well. We also are joined by Tammy Gulovich, chair of the board with the BCDHA, and Andrea Burton, the executive director with BCDHA. So without further ado, I am going to turn the podium over to our board chair, David McPherson.
Okay, there, can you hear me? Good. Wow, what a full house. Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. It really is good to see such a great turnout this morning. We really appreciate you getting out of your comfortable beds this morning and coming out. I think there's probably a lot of interest in what's been going on in the field of regulation, so I'm sure Jennifer's going to be fielding lots of questions. So to start with, on behalf of the board, the entire board of the College of Dental Hygienists of BC, welcome to the 2020 PDC Dental Hygiene Forum. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm David McPherson. I'm a public member, and I'm the chair of the board. I'm very pleased to be here with you today, to have the opportunity to meet with so many of you in person, and to speak with you as registrants. Now, you just might have noticed I got a little frog in my throat. I'm just getting over a cold, so hopefully I can make it through this without too much coughing and sputtering. I'll do my best. So I'd like to just start with a little bit of my background. I've served on the board since August 2016, and this is my third year now as the chair of the board. As they say, time flies when you're having fun, and it actually has been a privilege to serve on the board. Personally, it's been really a rewarding experience, and it's really my pleasure to contribute to the work of the college. I'm a social worker by profession, and I spent most of my career in social services with the provincial government. So serving the public and protecting the public interest has always been an important part of my career wherever I've worked. And I'm proud to continue that focus on public protection with the college. In just a few minutes, Jennifer will be providing us all with an overview of the many current issues in regulation. And I can tell you, as you probably are aware, there's been many interesting changes ahead, and it's going to be a very exciting year for all of us in the field of regulation. That old adage, you've probably all heard of it, may you live in interesting times, and I can tell you that's something we said at the board over many of our meetings. It's been a very interesting year. As a bit of a preamble, I'd like to take this opportunity to give you an overall perspective, I guess the board's perspective on health regulation in BC. To give you some context, and many of you are probably aware of this, but in BC there are 26 healthcare professions currently regulated by 20 colleges, of which dental hygiene is one. And all are governed under the Health Professions Act, known as the HPA. Good old HPA. So the HPA sets out our public protection mandate. And so this is a very important piece of legislation in BC. Everything we do as a board, all the decisions we make concerning strategy for the college, how we govern, the upholding of standards, absolutely everything requires that we keep the public's interest foremost in mind. But what does the college's public interest mandate mean to you as registrants? Well, when you think about it, the mandate to protect the public is an important benefit to the profession, to you as registrants in the eyes of the public. Because the services you provide must meet the standards and guidelines directly established by your peers within the college And because of that, the public can have confidence in how you deliver care to your clients. The public puts its trust in health professionals, and that's really critical. That's a key issue. And it is up to each of you as individual healthcare providers to maintain that trust. Well, how do you do that? You do that through the ongoing enhancement of your skills, by continually adding to your knowledge, and in the way you demonstrate professionalism every day and throughout your career. But beyond that, each of the 26 regulated health professions also has a duty to the public that encompasses all facets of professional conduct, including self-awareness and accountability for one's actions. Now, if I can just reflect back on this past year, as I mentioned, it's been a very interesting one for the college and for the board. Been very busy, marked by significant change. And certainly, you're probably aware the most significant change is the enactment of the amended dental hygienist regulations and the updated CDHBC bylaws. Now, hopefully you've seen those on the college website. One of the significant changes to the regulation is the removal of the 365-day rule, and I was told to pause for applause on that one. All right, okay. I'm not a practitioner, but being on the board, I've come to appreciate what a significant issue that is and that was. So it's probably going to be the only applause I get today, so I'm going to enjoy it. But it's important to pause and acknowledge that the modernization of dental hygiene regulations was a significant piece of work, not only for the college, but for a number of stakeholders. And I can tell you, being a board member, it was a lot of work. A lot of people involved, including, of course, a lot of the staff at the college did a heck of a lot of work on that. So on behalf of the board, I wish to thank everyone who was involved to make this a reality. The board feels confident that the amended regulations and bylaws represent an important step forward to create a regulatory environment that ensures the public has access to safe and competent dental hygiene care. That's job one as far as we're concerned. Now, just changing tacks a little bit, you may recall the past 2 years at this forum, there have been discussions on the Caton report. And I think anyone who's interested in regulation in BC has certainly heard of that report. This past fall, the MLA Steering Committee, which was formed to consider the recommendations in Part 2 of the Caton report, released a paper for consultation with recommendations to modernize the BC health regulatory framework. That's a big deal, as you can appreciate. One of the steering committee recommendations was to reduce the number of health regulators in the province through amalgamation. And I think you'd agree that's a major change, to say the least. And you'll probably be hearing more about that from Jennifer's presentation. I'm sure you'll have questions about that. Just so you know, the college did send in a very robust submission in response to that paper. And we continue to discuss the report and the implications that those recommendations may ultimately have. So it's on our radar big time. What will not be changing, I can tell you, is regardless of the final recommendations, what will not be changing is the focus on protecting the public and having the public's trust. And that's why we continue to be clearly focused on the college's mission statement, value statement, and strategic plan to uphold the public trust. And again, I'd refer you to our college website so you can have a look at those documents. So in conclusion, I want to say that as a board, we will continue to work tirelessly to ensure that the college upholds the public interest mandate and supports you as registrants so that dental hygiene can continue to have the public's trust and confidence. Thanks very much. And I'll turn the podium back over to Jennifer.
Thanks so much, David. So I have to say, this is my 12th PDC, and as David said, time does seem to fly when you're having fun. And I can tell you I could barely sleep last night because I think at 11 PDCs, I've stood on similar stages with similar PowerPoints and mentioned one day I'm going to stand up here and tell you the dental hygienist regulations have been amended and the 365-day rule is no more. Well, today's the day, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to say that. But before we get to the good stuff, I'm just going to take us through really quickly. David already mentioned it in his opening remarks, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But it is a really good idea to center ourselves in what the college mandate is, what our role is, and what our duties are under a piece of legislation. It's not something that the board decides, it's not something I decide, it is something that the provincial government decides. And that is to serve and protect the public, as you heard probably about 15 times placed throughout David's opening remarks, and obviously to exercise our powers and discharge our responsibilities in the public interest. So I actually did not include my famous lame graphic of the box within the box because I think you've probably already seen it enough, and if you haven't, all previous PDC presentations are on YouTube, so you can watch them, learn, and also see all my mistakes, which is always a fun place to be as well. We do obviously have a mission statement. We updated it a few years ago, and it is very clear, fulfilling our duty to protect the public through regulatory excellence. We strive to do this every single day, and it underpins every decision that the board makes and even the daily work of the staff. We do have value statements that we embody, ethics, we commit to ethical conduct, obviously in all of our regulatory practices and relationships. We want to demonstrate leadership through practice and visionary regulatory practices. Collaboration, this is a big one, and this word is probably going to be heard a lot today. But we commit to fostering collaborative relationships with all stakeholders to achieve exemplary regulatory practices. It is something that we lead by, and I hope that all our registrants also embrace. And transparency. We commit to open and transparent communication and decision-making process to facilitate a culture of trust. That is also a big piece, and I can tell you, we have lots of things to discuss today about the regulatory changes, both very positive and some that might feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I certainly, as I was building the PowerPoint for today, when I got to the second half, when I'm going to talk about maybe some of those more uncomfortable pieces, there was a part of me that said, oh, this is going to be such a great first half, and then I'm going to talk about the second half, and it's going to be a very up and down sort of presentation. Maybe I should just leave it out. But no, we embrace transparency. We want to build a culture of trust with not only the public, but with our registrants as well. So we're going to talk about even the uncomfortable bits too. So, what a segue. It's almost like I knew that slide was coming next. What we're going to talk about, obviously, we're going to talk about the interpretation of the amended regulations. We're going to talk about the information on the bylaw amendments. And then Heather is going to come up on stage and talk to you about the 2 new practice standards. Then we are going to get into the health regulatory framework proposed changes and other kind of next steps as all of this evolves. So let's get into it. I will say there is a mic in the center of the room. I don't know if you can see it because I know it's a little dark back there for you guys, but we did want you to be able to see the screen. And we also, I should say, we are videotaping this presentation as well as we've done in years past, so that those who are not able to join us today are able to view it at a later date. But there is a mic in the center of the room, so if you have questions, I would really ask you to go to the mic so that everybody can hear the question, myself especially, and then we'd be happy to answer them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the regulations, I'm going to pause for questions, I'm going to then get into the bylaws, I'm going to pause for questions, I'm going to have Heather come up, talk about the practice standards, we're going to pause for questions, so kind of at each chunk there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So hopefully you've seen this graphic on our website, but basically this just helps sort of understand how all these cogs in the wheel fit together, because they are all very interlinked, but there's different levels of responsibility on who does what, and I find it's very helpful to sort of understand who were the authors, where does the responsibility lie, and how do the pieces fit together. So as David mentioned, at the very top is the Health Professions Act. The HPA, that is the umbrella piece of legislation that governs 26 professions in 20 colleges. Underneath that, that is where our dental hygienist regulation lives, is under that act. So they are drafted and authored by government. Supporting the regulation is obviously our bylaws, as you probably well know. They really spell out more specific rules, if you will, around dental hygiene specifically. Those are drafted by CDHBC and approved by the board. And then we have the CDHBC practice standards, which are obviously also drafted by CDHBC and passed by the board. But those practice standards, as you can see by that final arrow, and there's a little dotted arrow, hopefully you can see, that go loop all the way back up to the regulations, because there are, in 2 of the regulations, they require practice standards for those regulations to be enacted. So those are sort of how all those pieces fit together, and they really provide that foundation to how the college does its work. All the programs kind of are built on those foundational pieces. All right. So number 1, removal of the 365-day rule. It is no more. There is no longer a regulatory requirement for clients to receive a dental exam within the past year in order to receive dental hygiene care. Now, I want to underline the regulatory requirement piece. It doesn't mean that now we're saying clients should never ever see a dentist ever again, go dental hygiene. That is not what we're saying. We're saying there is no regulatory prescribed requirement that people have to see a dentist once a year. However, it is best practice to be collaborative with dentists. We want you to ensure you are focused on client best-centered care. So some clients may need to see a dentist more often than once a year. Others, maybe it can go a little longer. But certainly do not take this and run away thinking, well, the college says nobody needs to see a dentist and that's it, that requirement is gone. That is not at all what we're saying. It's just there's no prescribed once a year regulatory requirement to do so. Dental hygiene diagnosis. So the ability to diagnose gingivitis or periodontitis is now enshrined in the regulation. Again, this probably isn't going to feel like a big change because you're probably all thinking to yourself, at least I hope you're all thinking to yourself, I've been doing this all along, what do you mean? It is now, though, enshrined because it is a restricted activity in our regulation. You also may be thinking to yourself, well, I identify way more things than just gingivitis or periodontitis. Absolutely. Please keep doing that. But you can't diagnose. So there's a difference between recognizing or identifying versus diagnosing. So under the regulatory structure here in BC, you can only diagnose something that you can actually treat or address. You can't diagnose something that you can't treat or address. So I guess the easiest thing to talk about would be decay, caries, those types of things. You can identify on the spectrum of decay, demineralization, all those good things. You can make the appropriate referrals and you can be collaborative with various members of the dental team. However, you can't diagnose that because obviously you can't provide permanent restorative procedures. So hopefully that makes sense. So please don't go away thinking the college is now saying you've got to have your blinders on and only look at gingivitis and periodontitis. That is not what we're saying. That's your diagnosis. But we absolutely expect you to continue to recognize various things beyond those 2 things and make the appropriate referrals. X-rays, yes, I know we usually use radiographs. Government uses X-rays, so it's X-rays in the regs. The ability to self-initiate intraoral radiographs for the purposes of your dental hygiene care and your dental hygiene diagnosis is now enshrined in the regulations. You are also able to perform extraoral radiographs upon authorization. So a health professional who is in a position to authorize extraoral radiographs is able to do that, and you can go ahead and do that. Local anesthetic, so the removal of dentist on-site requirement, so that you no longer need a dentist on-site to administer local anesthetic. So that's obviously another big change that has occurred. I think almost as exciting as the 365-day rule, but maybe it's bridesmaid, I don't know. However, to do so, LA containing epinephrine must be given a prescription, and you may be wondering why that is. At this time, local anesthetic that contains epi is a Schedule I drug, and in this round of regulatory updates, prescribing was not a restricted activity that was included in the dental hygienist regulation. Therefore, in order to comply with prescribing legislation, prescription needs to be authorized. Now, I actually made myself some notes because I know this is probably going to generate a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to pre-answer some of them, but I might not pre-answer all of them. Because I think maybe this idea of prescribing feels a little awkward, perhaps in dental offices. This really hasn't been a routine thing in the classic sense of prescription. So we have been dialoguing quite a bit with CDSBC about this change and how this is actually going to show up and look in everyday practice. And so we're actually working with them, and I think the important thing to say is, while we have been working on these changes for many, many, many years, we did not become aware of exactly what they were going to say until probably about the same time you did. So we've been only living with them for about a week and a half. So in fairness, we are still, figuring out how these are going to be regulated and interpreted. But what I can say, what the preliminary conversations with CDSBC have been, is for the purposes of local anesthetic, other than you don't need a dentist on site any longer, don't feel you need to upend what you've been doing to date. Continue what you've been doing, particularly in a collaborative dentist practice. You don't need to start changing and upending what you've been doing. For our private dental hygiene practitioners, we're still asking that you have a collaborative relationship with a dentist. You would have needed that under the old model to administer local anesthetic. We'd encourage you to continue to do that. And hopefully there'll be some more communication coming out very shortly with clarity on what does the prescription need to look like. Some preliminary discussions that we've had is that it can be written or verbal, so it doesn't have to be kind of that traditional script like you'd get from a physician. It can have an appropriate standing order, as it were, so for potentially 6 months, a year, things like that. Obviously, it has to be appropriately documented by either the dentist or the dental hygienist in the chart, particularly obviously if it's been verbal, but that just has to be documented. And really, I think the underlying message that we've heard from CDSBC is they're not intent on changing any sort of existing protocols, and they are encouraging that continued collaborative process with the dentist. So I hope this is going to be workable, that this doesn't feel too onerous. And like I said, stay tuned for further communication. I also should mention, as you've probably already skipped to the bottom of the slide, local anesthetic without epi does not require a prescription. It's not a Schedule I drug, so that is also an alternative option as well. Okay, a couple other little pieces before I pause for questions. The reduction of dislocation of a TMJ showed up in our regulations, so if this happens during practice, you can use manual therapy to reduce it, so you don't have to let someone have a locked jaw wandering around, so I guess that's good. That's a bit of a little anomaly, I think, in terms of restricted activity, but there it is. And then there's also under where the old Section 6 was, which is where the 365-day rule was and the dentist on-site rule was, there are new standards around private dental hygiene practice, and I'm not going to get too deep into these because this is the center of one of the new practice standards that Heather is going to be speaking about a little later. But for the purposes of the regulation, and this is where it might get a little confusing, so for the purposes of the regulation, private dental hygiene practice is defined as a practice where a dentist is not ordinarily on-site. Okay, so that section applies to a practice where a dentist isn't normally or ordinarily on site. Again, Heather's going to talk about the new practice standards. In that section, basically the main requirement of that section of the regulation is a recommendation to seek a dental exam in a situation where a dentist is not ordinarily on site. Now, there's two exceptions to that requirement. You don't have to make the recommendation if you know they have recently had a dental exam, or if you yourself have recently made that recommendation. And by recommendation, I want to be clear, it is a recommendation, it is a dialogue with the client. It doesn't have to take the form of a formal referral. Okay, so obviously refer if the person needs to be referred, if they have a condition that needs to be referred, refer, but in order to satisfy the regulation, a recommendation has to occur. And it should be client-centered, client-focused recommendation. Okay, I'm actually going to pause there to see if there's any questions on the regulation specifically before I get into the bylaws and the new registration categories and all that good stuff. Okay, well, if you think of something after, please feel free to get up or wave your arm. Oh, I see an arm over there. So the question was, how often must a recommendation to seek a dental exam be documented? So every time you make one, you should make a note in the chart. The exception for the requirement to make one is either they've already just received one, or you've yourself recently made one. So interpret that how you would like. Okay, so we're going to move on to the bylaws. I don't know how many of you have logged in post Monday. So like, can you imagine this timing? I mean, the regs come in about a week and a half ago. Our new bylaws came in on Monday, and here we are on Thursday. It's been busy, I'll just say that. However, you may or may not have noticed our registrant site went down on the morning of March 2nd, so we could have our database basically automatically reassign everyone their new registration categories. So if you haven't already, please log into your registrant profile and make doubly sure that your new category is appropriate. We're 99.99% sure it all went swimmingly. So basically, to clarify, and I'm actually just going to put all of this up here, and then I'll talk about it. All of you who are in the full category on March 1st should now be in the registered dental hygienist category C. All of you who are in the conditional category on March 1st should now be in the registered dental hygienist category. If you were in the 365 exempt registration category on March 1st, you now will be in the dental hygiene practitioner category C. And we're quite confident that just all happened magically, thank you to our IT people, and everyone automatically got their new categories. So these are the new categories. I think you've heard me speak about them before. These slides are meant for initial application. So upon initial application, if the initial applicant has a diploma, they are going to go into the registered dental hygienist category. That category is fully self-initiating, can practice a full scope, can practice in any other practice environment. The only restriction is they can't be the primary owner and operator of a private dental hygiene practice, which I'll get to in the next slide about how we define that. Upon initial application, dental hygiene practitioner is a degree, dental hygiene degree level entry. Again, they can practice the full scope. Only registrants in that category may own and operate a private dental hygiene practice, as I just said. It's important to note that private dental hygiene practices can hire registered dental hygienists who can go out and practice and not be bound by any practice restrictions like the old 365-day rule. So just to clarify that, it's the practitioner status really is about the ownership and the operation of the actual practice. It's not about how you practice. And then I want to also mention that the registration committee is busy working away to establish alternative pathways for those who are already in the registered dental hygienist category, or we're going to term them RDH, to move to the dental hygiene practitioner category, or DHP. So I've got lots of questions about, I don't have a degree, but I've got lots of experience, and I have some other levels of education. Would that get me a dental hygiene practitioner? And what I can say is we're working on it. We hope to have more information in due course. But I think one thing is certain. We had about 4 different pathways for people to go from full registration to 365 exempt registration, and we don't expect that to be drastically changed. We do expect there will be some opportunities to go from RDH to DHP, maybe without a dental hygiene degree. Okay? Okay, so how do we define, for the purposes of the bylaws, private dental hygiene practice? So really, I hope that when I'm speaking to this room, we can kind of just generally get a sense of what a private dental hygiene practice is or is not. I know there is some shades of gray, as there always is, but really when we think about a private dental hygiene practice, it's really a material degree over sort of a private clinic, whether it's a storefront, mobile, it doesn't have to be brick and mortar, that provides direct client care on a regular or continuous basis. It's not just a one-off. It's not just volunteering on a day. It truly is a practice that provides regular and continuous basis. The practice does not need to be incorporated necessarily. It can be a sole proprietorship, for example. And when we really think about it, it's the type of practice where the practice is responsible for the billing. So they actually deal with all the money. They're responsible for the advertising. They have a logo. They have a website. They advertise. They have a Facebook profile. Record retention. They are the owners of the record. They keep the record. They purchase and maintain the clinical equipment, et cetera. I've had a lot of questions of, well, you know, I'm not an employee of a dental practice. I contract with the dental practice, but the practice, basically, I use all their equipment. They bill. They keep the records. I don't, you know, take my charts away with me. Is that private dental hygiene practice? For the purpose of the bylaws, that answer would be no. But if you literally rented a chair and, you know, basically dragged in all your equipment and brought, you know, a file thing of all your charts, and you actually were the one handing the bill and collecting the money, and then, you know, took that all away at the end of the day, that would be private dental hygiene practice. I'm not sure there's many scenarios like that, but I have to admit that I thought we were pretty well informed of all the different ways hygienists practice, but certainly since these changes have come into effect, we've been made aware of a few different unique circumstances that we're working through. Or, and it should say that you are a director of a dental hygiene corporation or hold voting shares of a corporation. So usually those two things do actually go together, but there are a few circumstances where a dental hygienist may not actually work in the practice, but they're a voting shareholder of a corporation. So you have to be a dental hygiene practitioner for that. Okay, like I said, I'm going to pause for questions at the end. Some further amendments in the bylaws to be aware of. So as you heard me say about the C now on your license. So in the past, if you were in the full category, you had the ability to administer local anesthetic. If you came to us from a jurisdiction that did not have local anesthetic in its scope, or from an educational institution that did not teach local anesthetic, then you were put into the conditional category, and then you were given 2 years to get out of that conditional category. So 2 years to get your local anesthetic education, to get out of that category and into full. For a variety of reasons, that regulatory practice is not well endorsed. To remove someone's license after 2 years because they don't have a certain aspect of practice. Also, obviously, while low risk, certainly around contraindications for the administration of local anesthetic, it is one of the higher risk elements of dental hygiene practice. And so we've gone to this certification model. So there is not a requirement to maintain your certification. I hope everybody does. But there is no now time frame either to get your C if you don't have it, or if you don't want to keep it, you don't have to keep it. But to clarify, because you'll see this coming in your next renewal period, I'm actually quite glad the bylaws came in on March 2nd, so we got through the 2020 renewal period. And we have a whole year to talk about this, so we know what 2021 is going to look like. But certification will be needed to be renewed annually, just like your license. Think of your certification as kind of a second license, if you will. However, the question is, do we have to do anything to renew the license? You do not need to do anything on a yearly basis to renew your license. But just like when you renew your license, if you're at the end of your QAP cycle in that year, then you do have extra things you'd have to do at the end of that year that maybe you didn't have in the prior 4 years, right? So the LA certification is going to look kind of the same. So you do renew it every year, but probably once in your 5 years, and we are likely going to tie it to your QAP cycle to make it clear and easy. You will have to do some level of what we're going to term recertification. So there's a difference between renewal of certification and recertification. Now, I can't tell you for absolute certain what you will need to do to recertify, but what I can tell you is the current discussion is something that feels a lot like the GEM, the Jurisprudence Education Module, that will be supplied by the college, and that you will work through much like you do the GEM, and that will likely be the requirement to recertify. But we've got a bit of time. Wait for further communications on that. Okay, so and we're going to strike the right balance between ensuring public safety and making sure everyone who holds their C is current and competent to provide local anesthetic without being unduly burdensome to registrants given the level of risk associated with, well, let's say LA mishaps, as it were. Okay? There will now be a CPR requirement. So for 2021 to renew, you will need to have current CPR on file with us. That has now been added to your registrant profile. You'll be able to upload that. There is already on our website a short list of approved or accepted providers. It is the healthcare practitioners level CPR, and there's lots of guidelines on that. If you already have CPR, just upload it. All we need to make sure is that it doesn't expire during the renewal period, and you're good to go. And then lastly, reinstatement changes. So the current process is still in place to reinstate with the college within 60 days of renewal closing. I have to say, and I know all of you in here probably aren't needing to reinstate, but one thing I was actually absolutely thrilled about this year, and it's actually been a growing trend, which is, I think, absolutely fantastic. The numbers of people that need to reinstate is way down. On the last day of renewal, we only had about 200 registrants that needed to renew out of 4,100. And I can tell you during my 13 years as registrar, that's the lowest number on the last day that I've ever seen by a long shot. So good on you for getting it done, doing it on time. I think that's absolutely awesome. And I think probably out of those 200, probably we're going to only have maybe a handful, or actually, I shouldn't say, I think we only have now 90 people who didn't renew. So about 110 renewed on that last day. We only have about 90. We're probably only going to have a handful needing reinstatement. Usually we do have some attrition at the end of the renewal period. So that was really great to see. But the change that I wanted to mention before I stop here for questions is we've actually added new provisions to reinstate beyond the 60 days. So before, at the end of April, if you had not reinstated your license, you were completely removed from the register, and the only way to get back on was to apply as if you were a brand new registrant, supplying all the necessary paperwork, all the necessary fees, and you had to apply as if you were brand new. Now, that is no longer the case. You can reinstate. I think the deadline is 5 years. I'd have to go back and look at the bylaws, but you can reinstate within 5 years. Now, there will be some other requirements once you're past the 60 days related to currency and competency, but you won't have to reapply as if you were a brand new registrant. So it will be at least less expensive, and we also then can be assured that someone who's, say, been out of practice for 3 years has to demonstrate some currency and competency before they come back to practice. Okay, questions? Now, I see a lot of hands. I actually am going to institute my rule that we line up at the mic, so I don't miss anybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Is the LA certification going to up our license fee?
Your fees remained, had a slight increase this year, but at this time, the board has not discussed adding a fee specific to local anesthetic certification. I think it's part, even though you have to renew it at like a second license, I think it's still part of your license.
Okay. Hi.
Hello.
Some of us were just noticing if we've done the degree, it's still showing as RDH and not the practitioner.
Right. So if you were full before, you went over to RDH. If you have a degree and now wish to apply for DHP, because there's now no practice hour requirement, you can apply to upgrade to DHP if you already have a dental hygiene degree. We just have not sent out that declaration form because this literally happened on Monday and there were some other things that we needed to get done before then. But yes, you will probably be seeing communication that if you already have a degree, dental hygiene degree, but were full before the change, you can upgrade.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, I
Hi.
have a question about the CPR, if you could just clarify. In some jurisdictions, even though the HCP CPR is valid for 3 years, they make us renew it annually. Do we have to renew it annually in BC,
As long as
or
your
is the
CPR
3 years is fine?
Yeah, as long as the CPR from wherever you've gotten it from is current, that will suffice for the period that it's current. Yep.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up to that question.
Sure.
I just did my healthcare provider and they've now changed it to basic life support. HCP was valid for 3 years. Basic life support is only valid for 1.
Right.
So if we're having to have it valid, you said as long as it doesn't expire during the registry period. So is that as long as we renew it during the registry period?
Right. So it's going to be a date you're going to have to keep in mind depending on when you got it. But as long as when it's in our database and as long as the expiry date is not expired, you will be able to renew.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Hello.
My question is related to local anesthetic because
Okay.
my place of employment is in public health, so
Okay.
I don't administer LA.
Mhm.
However, I am now a dental hygiene practitioner. So
Yep.
how would that affect me? I guess that's the question.
So are you thinking in terms of like certification? Right.
Recertification.
So again, I can't say for sure because I don't want to prejudge the Quality Assurance Committee's decisions, but it doesn't sound like the Quality Assurance Committee is going to be expecting a hands-on refresher to maintain your C. So it will literally be up to you whether you want to do whatever the requirement is to maintain the C, or as a dental hygiene practitioner, you can also let your C go if you want, and there is a way to get it back. If you've let it go and you want it back, there's a way to get it back, but it literally will be up to you whether you feel you want to keep it or not.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The prescription for epinephrine can be verbal or written,
Yep.
and it can be long-standing. I know with regular prescriptions, just from pharmacy, they also have a 1 year, they're done sort of thing, if the prescription's older than a year. As long as we're documenting, even if it's verbal, after the year is up, and we just get another verbal prescription, that's okay?
Yep.
Doesn't have to be,
Now I shouldn't say
refills,
just
3
yep.
refills,
I
or
think
anything?
that is how it's going to work.
Okay.
That's the dialogue at the moment.
okay, and
Yep.
for, you mentioned there's more coming too. So when the dentist prescribes epinephrine, he doesn't have to specifically say for 4 appointments or for 5 appointments of this person coming in. It could just be whenever they come in for their hygiene, whether
I
it's
mean,
3
I
months,
would
4 months.
I would go back to the standards around whoever the prescriber is. So if it is the dentist, I would go back to whatever those standards would be. Like I said, the communication we've had thus far is I don't think it can be a standing prescription forevermore for the next 20 years. So I think whoever the prescriber is has to decide what they feel comfortable and is most clinically appropriate for how long that prescription stands. So it could be
As
6 months,
needed,
it could
or-
be a year, it could be 2 years. I think that will be up to the individual client and prescriber determine what is safest for that client.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As a dental hygienist that started off as an RDH and then transitioned into the 365-day category and now a dental hygiene practitioner, I can say in the 38 years that I have been practicing, not once has a patient asked me what my registration entitled me to do. So I just think that, you know, there's a lot of talk about having to put a C at the end of my name or whatever. Let's not go down a rabbit hole. Like, this is going to happen so rarely where, and it's not hard to explain what that C means if somebody asks you, but I think honestly, this is a great day. Let's not, you know.
Thank you, and I think too, I mean, I think Marilyn's point is well taken. I think this also is helpful for other health professionals and when you're communicating with other health professionals, because this actually it lines up with how other health professionals are licensed. And so I actually think what the benefit here is other health professionals, even outside the dental world, will be better able to understand what the license means, and for them, a C won't be weird, because a whole host of other health professions have that type of model.
I came in a little late, so it might have been addressed. Just curious, with the no 365 anymore, do you anticipate our liability insurance going up? And if so, like by how much?
Well, I don't provide the insurance. That would definitely be a CDHA discussion. However, I hope not, because the 365-day rule did not make you any less responsible for the care you were providing. It was a regulatory requirement. It didn't minimize you as a practitioner around the decisions you made and the care you provided. So to me, it makes zero difference around your care, and therefore your liability insurance shouldn't be affected, but that's not my purview to control. That's just my perspective. Okay. I'm now going to turn it over to Heather, who is going to talk to you about practice standards.
I'd rather use the green button.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now, I don't have a lapel pipe, so I'm going to be tethered here, so just bear with me. I think there's a few little items. Excellent. All right, now that we've had an opportunity to take some time to look at the regulatory architecture and how it's been established and rolled out for dental hygienists in British Columbia, I'm going to take some time with you to look at things from a bit more of a granular perspective. We're going to wade into the practice standards that have been developed specifically for two areas and how they may impact your practice. So the background has mostly been covered, but we are going to talk about these three terms of standards, limits, and conditions. What do those mean, and why are we actually talking about them? And then we'll look at some of the highlights of the standards themselves. So the why part of this question is really linked to what Jennifer was originally telling us about the new regulations. There are two separate sections, 5.2 with respect to radiography and 6.2 with respect to private dental hygiene practice that require, they actually have language that require that standards, limits, and conditions be established so that dental hygienists can practice these areas, as we have already been practicing them. And so those practice standards are going to be articulated, and generally the content that we're going to be covering today is not new or different. A lot of it you'll see as familiar. It's previously existing either in other practice standards and needed to be just brought together and organized a bit differently, articulated differently, and information has also been brought over from the interpretation guidelines. And the key part of practice standards is that they help to describe safe and ethical practice. So it is important to have a place where dental hygienists, the public, other health professionals can look to see what those expectations are. And really, part of the move forward is to contemporize these two new practice standards. And I'm going to talk to you in a couple slides about how these practice standards will look a little different to you than the pre-existing ones. But first of all, what is a standard? Standards, limits, and conditions are regulatory language, and they have been provided some definition through the BC College of Nursing Professionals, which we've borrowed here to share with you. And a standard is generally an expectation. It's that benchmark of expected care, above which can be attained higher, but below which would not be acceptable care. A limit, really, that's the parameter. Those are kind of the outside boundaries of practice. So that specifies what a dental hygienist may or may not do. And here's an example with respect to scaling below the gingival margin, but not excising soft tissue. So that's a very obvious one. And conditions, those are the requirements for practice. So for example, for local anesthetic, in order to complete or to administer LA, you would have to have completed an approved course. Those are the conditions set for that particular procedure. Now this slide is going to look, you're not going to be able to read the first 8 because those are the existing 8 practice standards that we have had captured in our, what we call Schedule E in bylaw since the beginning of our regulatory time. Those 8 practice standards speak to topics such as informed consent, safe practice, documentation, and of course the full ADPI process of care. Now, the 2 additional standards that you see, 9 and 10, we're going to look at those individually, and I'm going to blow them up so you'll be able to read them, don't worry. I just wanted you to see how they fall and why they're added onto the end of the existing 8. Now, because we have new bylaws in place, we have a new section that speaks to practice standards. Previously, those 8 standards were listed in Schedule E, and they couldn't easily be changed or altered. Now there's a reference in Section 71 of our new bylaws that says that the board may establish standards, limits, and conditions that registrants would comply with. And this also aligns with the HPA, and so it all speaks to the same need for standards, limits, and conditions. Now, in contemporary practice standards, these standards, limits, and conditions are woven through those practice standards. They don't just sit as a separate entity or a statement all by themselves. So these 2 new standards that we've developed are actually in line with some of the more modern frameworks, such as the one that the College of Nursing Professionals have developed. The occupational therapists in Australia have a wonderful model as well. So an environmental scan was done to determine, really what is at the forefront of practice standard language, and you'll see that articulated in these particular ones. So let's just move forward. Pardon me, I think I'm going to lose my voice this morning. Practice Standard 9 speaks specifically to radiography. And the first thing I'd like to point out is how the language is a bit different. The pre-existing 8 practice standards that we're all familiar with start out with a dental hygienist must. And there's always been sort of this difficulty around must versus may versus should. And the Caton report that we've heard referenced and that Jen will talk a little bit more about does really bring some scrutiny to the difference between must and shoulds and practice standards versus guidelines, and all of that language is quite important. And so what we have done is we've followed in the line of the more contemporary practice standards and moved away from musts and shoulds. So instead you'll see these active verbs. So a dental hygienist applies and interprets. Okay, so that's going to be consistent as we move forward. I think the other piece to just let you know is that while we've created these 2 new practice standards for the purposes of the enactment of the regulations here and now, the existing 8 will be the phase 2 of this project. So that is a much greater undertaking. Those 8 practice standards are going to be redeveloped and revisioned. Resources are going to be combined from the interpretation guidelines, and we're going to end up with a beautiful new suite of practice standards that is essentially one comprehensive document that you can be directed to for the information on how your practice can function. So that's kind of the framework that we're working within, and this particular practice standard has a number of policy statements that you're going to see under it, and that's generally going to be the framework moving forward. So the piece from this that I'd really like you to focus on is a dental hygienist applies ionizing radiation and interprets radiographs as appropriate for the client. Client-centered care is really going to be at the forefront of our conversation, and also for the sole purpose of dental hygiene process of care. So when you're asking yourself the question about what radiographs do I need and when, it is client-centered and for the sole purpose of dental hygiene care. So here's a bit of a graphic to give you a sense of some of the elements that are highlighted in this practice standard. And I would encourage you to go back to our website and read the practice standards. They're written there. We've got links to them throughout the information we've been sending you, but it's good to read them verbatim, line by line. We're just really capturing the highlights for you here today. So radiographs, as you know, are just one piece of the data set that you'll be collecting for each of your clients. And the idea is that the determination of the need for radiographs happens after the intraoral exam. It's not a take radiographs and then go on with your exam. There does need to be an assessment of need established at the outset. As well as that, the need for requesting and sharing has really been emphasized. So in this being a client-centered conversation, reducing the number of exposures is paramount. So before you take radiographs, a good question to ask is, are there any that can be requested? Are there any that exist for this client? And how recent are they? How applicable are they? So requesting and then sharing. Who else may need these radiographs, and ensuring that they are taken, these images are in a way that can be shared. If they're electronic, then they can be shared securely. If they happen to be in a conventional manner, that they have a duplicate attached to them, so that you really do have that ability to reduce the number of exposures for your clients. And then, of course, the documentation piece is wound and woven through everything. You need to be documenting the number of exposures, the type of exposures, and then, of course, your findings. And here the emphasis is on not only the findings that serve your purposes for your dental hygiene process of care, but findings that are beyond normal, the abnormal pathologies that you might see that require a referral. And then if that referral is necessary, that be documented and linked back as well. So that's the process around radiographs that is highlighted in this particular standard. Now, a couple of items just to highlight for you around informed consent. Informed consent is already touched on in a previous practice standard where we recognize that, but because of the scrutiny around radiographs and having a new practice standard, it does need to be re-articulated. So it's really just a reminder that that informed consent needs to happen prior to exposing so that the client or their representative can fully understand what the process will be, what the expectations or outcomes might be, what the costs might be, and all of that is a conversation that's happening up front. And then, of course, before you go to share those radiographs, consent needs to be obtained as well. The other piece of this that might look new to you is the informed refusal to consent. And that is dealt with in other places in our resources, but it's re-articulated here just as a reminder that that conversation loop needs to be closed with the client. If they refuse radiographs, they need to be informed as to what some of the risks might be associated with that refusal, and that there's an acknowledgement of that decision and a signature to indicate, not so much from a liability perspective, but so that the client and the dental hygienist both understand that that conversation has been had. All right, so now we get into the limits and conditions. What we've talked about already are really the expectations, the standards. The limits and conditions I will outline for you here. These first two are ones that we'd like to just spend a couple of minutes clarifying around, because the regulations are quite explicit in identifying that dental hygienists may only expose intraoral radiographs. And so those would be periapicals or bite wings for the purposes, of course, for dental hygiene care. And now that we also recognize that there are clients in situations where intraoral radiographs cannot be tolerated or might not be achievable. And so an extraoral bite wing might be something that you would like to accomplish. And that is still absolutely available to you through the ability to have an authorized or qualified individual authorize that radiograph. So if you're working in an office where you're collaborating with a dentist or other healthcare practitioners that are authorized to prescribe radiographs, then you can still go ahead and obtain that extraoral radiograph in a collaborative sense. If you're working externally and you don't have access to that, then you want to be leaning on your collaborative relationships. So again, just the piece that we wanted to clarify here, and also part of this conversation is around Panorex. So having a pan is something that we often, well, first of all, dental hygienists are educated to expose and to interpret Panorex radiographs. However, they're not, we can't argue that they are a requirement for dental hygiene process of care. They're nice to have, they contain a lot of information, but with that information comes accountability. And there is an ongoing conversation across health professions around the risk associated with large images and all of the anatomy that's contained in that. And so for dental hygiene purposes, it needs to be a more limited approach to ensure that the anatomy that's being exposed is well within your ability to diagnose and treat. So again, having a Panorex is something that can be collaborated on with a dentist authorizing it if that's the requirement for a particular client in a collaborative practice, but it is not necessarily to be a go-to as a data piece for your dental hygiene process of care. I've touched on this already. Any referrals, of course, would be indicated if there are findings outside of the dental hygiene scope, and those would be documented in the treatment record. And finally, just a reiteration, as Jen mentioned at the beginning, you'll hear a lot about collaboration, and this really is a time for us to recognize the importance of working within an interprofessional and intraoral healthcare team so that we can really establish those relationships and lean on one another and make the best of the opportunity to provide care for our clients. And all of this is truly in the efforts of ALARA, so as little as reasonably achievable in terms of radiographic exposure. All right, so number 9 dealt specifically with radiography. Practice Standard 10 deals specifically with private dental hygiene practice. And I might just take a moment to acknowledge that this is a different term. So we've generally gotten comfortable with independent practice, and among dental hygienists, we know what we mean. But cross professions and even with the public, it infers a sort of a siloed approach to practice, which we know is not the case. It's not the intent. We emphasize collaboration. And so it was determined that private dental hygiene practice would actually be a more inclusive term. It's better understood, and it certainly provides this sense of collaboration and teamwork. It's also used in a number of different professions, and so private dental hygiene practice is what we will be using moving forward to describe this type of practice. Now, there are 5 sections that are highlighted under Practice Standard 10, and these are simply additional components for individuals that are practicing in a private dental hygiene practice. The assumption is that you've already been aware of 1 to 9 and you're complying with those, but if you have a particular practice that is either owned by a dental hygiene practitioner that you're working for, or you are the practice owner, you need to be aware of these additional ones. So let's just take a look at them a little bit more closely. They're listed here for you. So radiography has a few additional pieces to it: infection prevention and control, record retention and billing, marketing, and recommending a dental exam. So we'll touch on each of those as we go through. I think it bears mentioning as well, though, that a dental hygiene practitioner can employ others. They may employ another health professional, given that that health professional's regulatory framework allows and permits for that. And they also may hire individuals who are assisting in various capacities that aren't regulated. But whatever the case may be, their personnel and their supervisory capacity is their responsibility. And so especially for those who are not regulated, the dental hygiene practitioner is responsible for issues around confidentiality, infection prevention and control, et cetera. So there is that level of accountability and oversight that must be highlighted. So let's talk about the limits and conditions specific to private dental hygiene practice for radiography. Radiographic equipment that is owned by the dental hygiene practitioner would of course comply with the radiation protection program, and that is not anything new. So for those of you who own radiographic equipment, you'll be familiar with this. It involves a certification process that happens on a regular interval, first of all when you initially purchase the equipment, and then annually that certification is submitted to the college. So it is an ongoing process, it's been in place for years, and there's nothing new about it, it just needs to be reiterated here. Beyond that, any use of hazardous materials or chemicals, of course, need to be dealt with appropriately according to government guidelines. And we reiterate that when you take images, especially in a private dental hygiene practice, it needs to be with the intent to be able to share them. So the recommending a dental exam or a need to refer, all of those will actually require you to share your documentation. So your images need to be shareable as well. Infection prevention and control, really nothing has changed at all because we do have a guideline that was established back in 2012 in conjunction with the College of Dental Surgeons, and that is still applicable to all practice settings. And we just highlight here that if you're practicing in a setting that might have you transporting equipment back and forth, that might have you working in different types of bedside situations or chairside situations, that there are expectations around how you transport your materials, how you set up and manage the infection prevention and control. So that just references you back to this particular guideline. Again, nothing new, just a matter of a point of reference. So for the record retention and billing, as a practice owner, you of course have responsibilities around your records, and the Limitations Act specifies that 16 years is the time frame for maintaining records. There's an additional time frame added for minors, and some other conditions might be considered for those with a disability or those who have been deceased. I would recommend that for those last two instances, you probably get some legal consult because each case is unique. But for the most part, the Limitations Act is the piece of legislation that gives you the information around how to manage your charts and your documentation. This next piece is just a reminder that clients would not be turned away from practice based on the insurance coverage that they have, whether it be third party or whether it be some other form of insurance that might leave them with overages. And part of this is about having the client have informed choice, and ultimately a full conversation would take place around the treatment plan, the potential cost of care, the coverage that they may or may not have in their insurance, and then the choice rests with the patient or client as to whether or not they want to proceed with care. So again, it's about providing information to the client or their representative up front and allowing that conversation to rest with informed consent on behalf of that individual. Now, for marketing for private dental hygiene practice, this is another one where nothing has changed. We are simply re-articulating the information that currently exists within the bylaws and the interpretation guidelines, as well as some of the practice standards. So it's being reiterated within Practice Standard 10 because that's the place that you would go to if you owned a private dental hygiene practice. So I'm not going to dig into this because it is simply a reiteration of existing information. Now, the recommending of a dental exam in private dental hygiene practice, we've already had an opportunity to touch on that. Jen has covered it fairly nicely, and I'd like to just highlight for you the language that's actually used here in the practice standard. So these are the bullets that are pulled from the practice standard so that you can see that it actually is about that comprehensive oral care that's being provided for each of your clients, and the acknowledgement that part of that care might happen outside of your practice setting. And of course, the terminology around recently is a bit ambiguous, but intentionally so that it provides the professional discretion to determine how often each client should have a dental exam, and that recommendation would be made accordingly. So again, it doesn't limit you to a particular time frame. We've happily let that go with the 365-day rule, and now each particular individual that you see and treat can be provided with a recommendation based on their own needs. And I'd like to just finalize with an excerpt from the terminology in the practice standards. And this is just really to highlight the distinction between what is recommending a dental exam and what is referring, because we find that that is still causing some confusion for registrants, and we want to be sure that you understand the difference. So again, recommending a dental exam is about a conversation that speaks to the greater oral health of an individual, the comprehensive need of their oral care, and it is based on a client's particular need, and it is simply a conversation. What the client does with that is their prerogative. The next piece around referral is more directed, and so referrals are specific to a particular finding. It might be an abnormality, or a pathology that you've identified either intraorally, or it might be another health-related issue. Whatever it might be, it requires the care of another health professional for a particular reason, and would generally involve the transfer of documentation to support that. It might also include the naming of a particular health professional to encourage or support the client in seeking that additional care. So hopefully that has helped to distinguish between these two different elements so that you can understand what your responsibilities are within your particular practice setting, whether you're practicing collaboratively within an oral healthcare team or whether you're practicing as part of a private dental hygiene practice. So now I'm going to turn to some questions, and if there's any, please feel free to use the microphone at the center.
Hi.
Hi.
I've worked for many different collaborative offices that have a dentist in them, and many of them would like regular extraoral panoramic X-rays, say every 5 years for all of their patients. Does that count as authorization for me to take them without asking them before in their appointment, before they have their recall exam?
Well, I think it's important to have a conversation with your colleagues just around the best and most appropriate care for clients. Certainly, Safety Code 30 speaks a little bit differently to the frequency of radiographs. So I think that's something that would be good to maybe revisit as a group, and certainly if that's how the authorization has been dictated so far, then you'd be well within your position to continue. It's just probably the best practice around that might need to be revisited.
Hello. In our practice, we do have a form where for informed refusal for the X-rays, the client signs, prints their name, and the dentist signs it as well. With the new standard, do we need to add it for the RDH as well, or is the dentist signing it good enough?
So how is it currently? I'm
We
missing the
currently
distinction.
have it worded outlining the risks of refusing X-rays for clients, and they sign and print their name, and our dentist signs it. And now with the new standard of the RDH having to sign their name as well, is it good enough having the dentist's name on the file, or do we need to add our name as well?
That would be up to you. It's also something that you could document in the chart, and I think it comes back to generally who is prescribing that radiograph. So if it had come originally from the dentist, then it would make sense that that refusal form was initiated and finalized with the dentist. If it's coming from yourself, you might want to document that in the chart.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning.
Hi.
I stepped out for a sec, so I'm not sure if this question was already asked, but in my office, our standard is if a person declines X-rays, we have a note in the chart they've declined the X-rays, rather than having them have to sign a piece of paper and making them potentially make them feel shameful about saying no about taking X-rays. Is that still going to be, since it's our standard, is that going to be okay?
Well, I would encourage you to maybe just kind of reframe how you approach it. It's really not about making them feel shameful at all, as you know.
We don't
but
talk to them about shameful, but we
of
just have
course.
decided that we don't want to.
Yeah.
put them on the spot that
And
way.
I think it's how you frame it, and certainly having the client and yourself sign off of it allows you both to have understood that you did have that conversation, and you don't necessarily need to bring it up every single time, and it just allows that conversation loop to be completed. So if you're able to frame it a little bit more openly and have them sign off, I think it would accomplish both.
Okay, but if we still follow this, will it cover us basically? Because like, I'll discuss it with them and then let them know I'm going to write a note into your chart just to say you've declined
And then
having these
having the
X-rays
client
taken.
sign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they need to sign it?
It's just a quick initial, and that's a piece of it that, again, allows you to look back and recognize that they were part of the conversation, that they understood the risks, that you'd had a full informed consent.
When you're
discussion.
paperless, though, how does that work for them to
Yeah,
sign?
that's a great question, because that has come
Yeah.
up, and certainly you could create a form that you could then have the statement and the signatures on, and you could scan it and save it as part of their file.
Okay, I'll bring that up when I get back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
Hi, I have a question. If the client, the patient, signs the refusal for treatment and later on something has been overlooked, does it mean we provided a negligent care?
I really can't speak to that. I think every case is going to be unique, and certainly having them understand the risks associated with refusing is an important component. And then you can, every case is going to be unique, and you really can't, I think, predict where that original responsibility would lie for whatever was missed.
Can the hygienist refuse the treatment in order not to provide the negligent care then?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Can the hygienist refuse the treatment in order not to provide the negligent care due to refusal for the X-rays?
Yeah, so I'm not sure it's about providing negligent care at all. It's simply informing the individual what your recommendations for the best care would be, and then allowing them to choose. And there are, really you've established what you can do, and you've accomplished that by signing off on it. And so I think to start assuming that there might be other potential missing things down the road would be kind of going down the rabbit hole. And you have done what is expected by your regulatory college, and so from that perspective, you would be well covered.
Sorry, Heather, I'm just going to interject just quickly. I think you have to look at the practice standards as a whole, 1 through 10. And one of the practice standards is dental hygienists must also practice safely. So on the one hand, it is absolutely the client's right to choose their care and direct their own care, but you yourself also have to be able to practice safely, and you can't ignore one to accomplish the other. So I think maybe what you might be getting at is if whatever they're refusing to makes it unsafe for you to proceed, then there is a whole process in place around refusing care. And we have a guideline on our website about that. And if you're in that situation, I would encourage you to, at least if you're in a collaborative setting, reach out to other team members. If you're not, maybe contact the college, because that gets really tricky. Refusing care is usually not a great thing, but at the same time, you absolutely have the right not to be put in a place where you're providing unsafe care. So it's a very delicate act between allowing a registrant or a client to choose their care and making sure you have the ability to practice safely. You may need to alter the care plan because of their refusal to consent to certain aspects, and you need to ensure that they are well informed about that refusal and why it's being altered. But at the end of the day, you also have the duty to practice safely. So maybe that also helps. But these should be very rare, unique circumstances that I would encourage you to approach collaboratively with other members of the dental team.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you got one more.
Hi, Heather. This is just a question that I wanted to ask. I know as it stands right now, if a registered dental hygienist only has their diploma and wants to pursue opening up their own private practice, they need to go under the PLAR assessment and then basically go through that process of a 6-month online training. Are you guys going to in the future maybe look at a different method of being able to get accredited and have the opportunity to open up private practice without having to go through TRU, because sometimes that gets to be a challenge communicating with the other individual. Do you guys think that that might be an option in the future, a proposal of that kind? of the.
Sure, yeah. So that speaks to a potential pathway to go from RDH to DHP without a dental hygiene degree. Like I said, the registration committee is currently considering what those pathways may look like. And certainly I know that they will establish some. What that actually looks like, I can't really say for sure right now.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay. You left me the thing. Okay, so now we are going to get into the Caton report. Yay! About almost 2 years ago to the day, the Minister of Health, the BC Minister of Health, ordered a review of CDSBC by Chief Executive of the UK Professional Standards Authority, Harry Caton, hence the Caton report. The review was initiated to investigate recent difficulties experienced by CDSBC and make recommendations for improved governance and regulatory performance of CDSBC. But before we just, focus on CDSBC, the review also was to consider how our Health Professions Act and how the regulatory system in BC was performing. So yes, there was a specific review of CDSBC, but there's also quite a substantial review of all of us entirely. And so he delivered his report to the minister on the end of the year in 2018, and it was actually released shortly after PDC last year in 2019. And originally I was actually going to keep this relatively short because I thought I actually talked to you more about this last year, but upon reflection the report actually hadn't come out, so I was only speaking about what the investigation was ordered to do and not actually the contents of the report. So I am going to go through the next couple of slides really quickly because this is about a year old and there obviously has been developments since this time. So the report is actually divided into two parts. It's a fairly decent sized report. If you're at all interested, it's up on the government website. Part 1 deals specifically with CDSBC. Part 2 considers the Act as a whole and the health regulatory system generally. Part 1 contains 21 recommendations for improvement at CDSBC. The minister endorsed all of those 21s and directed CDSBC that they basically had a month to present a plan on how they were going to address and implement those recommendations. Dr. Chris Hacker, who is their registrar, and his team has been doing amazing work over at CDSBC. It really has represented a full-scale shift in their work over there, and they are absolutely to be applauded and respected for that. So they do have an action plan. There's lots of information on the CDSBC website that you can look at and see what they've been up to. And really, actually, maybe I think it would be fair to say maybe they were at the back of the pack as a group, and they have leapfrogged in front of the pack in terms of embracing best practices and regulatory governance. They've changed their bylaws substantially around their board composition, and they actually have another set currently posted. So what did those recommendations include? And I want to go through them not because I want to target CDSBC specifically, because these recommendations are good recommendations for governance generally, not only even of health regulators, but just generally speaking. So a reduction in board size. And also these recommendations will also help explain what I'm going to get to in about 5 or 6 slides. A 3-year cooling off period before former association board members can run for the college board. We currently have a 1-year cooling off period as an aside. No one that is a subject of a complaint can run for the board, and that board member should step aside if they have a complaint made against them. So if they're on a board and a complaint's made, they need to step aside. No one that has a complaint upheld should be a member of the board or committee. Increased board transparency. So we all have to have board meetings publicly. And we do have the mechanism to go what we call in camera, which means those portions are not public. There's a whole list of reasons why we can do that. And the recommendation is that list should be short and finite, that you should be conducting yourself and not abusing the ability to go in camera. Recalibration of the board's relationship with senior staff, one of mutual respect. One focuses on operations, one focuses on governance, and they need to respect each other. The board needs to remove itself from involvement in the complaints process and not interfere into complaints in any way. They improve the reach and response of its annual complaint survey. So CDSBC actually surveys people who make complaints and registrants who are involved in the complaints process, not to find out if they were happy with their particular outcome, but what was their experience about the process. Build a different relationship with its dentist registrants, one of both mutual respect and distance. This is one of my favorite quotes. I hope we've done that with our registrants. It's always a work in progress between, we obviously regulate in the public interest, but you register with us and we provide you service. So we do have to establish that appropriate level of relationship. Commit greater time, respect, and interest to CDAs and dental therapists. Better and more regular engagement with the 3 other dental colleges. I will say this last one, I don't want it to sound like we never talk. As you heard, we've been talking quite a bit. And I think at the staff level, this was occurring quite regularly and quite successfully. I think, again, this related more to the governance mechanism in the board level. When collecting fees, the college should inform dentists more clearly which part of the fees go to the college and which go to the association respectively. So unlike what you see over at CDSBC, it was just kind of lumped into one lump sum and they didn't see the breakdown. However, there was also a recommendation that the college should resolve to stop collecting fees for the BCDA in a period of no more than 3 years. And so that was a year ago now. So I think that's obviously something we have paid attention to because of the change that we made. And we are obviously, the board and the staff are currently dialoguing and considering what that future may hold for CDHBC as well. So then we'll move on to part 2. And like I said, I went through those quite quickly, but they will help inform and make more sense of what I'm about to share with you. So part 2, like I said, considered the overall system. The minister struck a 3-member all-party committee made up of himself, Norm Letnick, the BC Liberal health critic, and Sonia Furstenau, the Green health critic, to consider part 2. I actually should have updated that little bullet because they did present a consultation paper, but it does recommend a 2-phase approach to reform. And like I said, they issued a consultation paper at the end of November of 2019 with a bunch of recommendations. So, oh, she's not there. Where'd you go? She asked me about this. She was in a lovely yellow sweater. Hopefully she's still somewhere about what I'm about to share. So the consultation paper recommendations include, so for the first section talks about improved governance. This will make sense given what I just mentioned. Fully appointed boards. So we're moving away from electing registrant or professional members and going to a fully appointed board. So both professional and public members will be appointed by the Minister of Health. There will still be professional members on the board, but instead of running for election and being elected by registrants, because that creates this idea of representation, which has been very problematic for a whole host of colleges, because it gives this idea that, you know, dentists represent dentists on the board and they're going to go and take the college back for dentists. That's a problem. 50-50 professional and public members. Traditionally, it's been 2/3, 1/3. They want to go to a 50-50 model. A competency-based board. So again, setting out a list of needs and competencies for board members to fulfill to make sure that there is a well-balanced, competent board. And again, a reduction in board number. There's a few boards that are quite large. That's slowly changing, but no more than 8 to 12 members. And ensuring that board members are fairly compensated and are equitably compensated as well. So public members aren't compensated differently than professional members. Okay, this is the slide that my legs are shaking a little. Reduction in the number of colleges. So that was the second piece of their recommendations. And I'm going to say, this is the MLA steering committee paper. This is not the college. I am the messenger. Don't shoot me. So they are proposing 20 down to 5. Yep. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC, the BC College of Nursing Professionals, and the College of Pharmacists of BC will remain as is. The 4 dental-related colleges will go into 1 oral health college. And the 13 remaining colleges are going to go into 1. Pause for reaction. So this may feel uncomfortable, and I would be lying to say that myself, our board chair, our entire board, our staff, probably had even more of a significant reaction initially to this than maybe you're even having. However, once we took a breath and recentered ourselves and thought intelligently about it, this isn't the end of the world. And what I want to say is these are just recommendations. We don't know what the final outcome will be. But when thinking about it, and in the initial dialogue we've had with the 3 other dental colleges, this isn't about going back to 1995, where CDSBC regulated everyone and there was a vast majority of dentists on the board. This isn't about one profession regulating another. This is about establishing a new entity to regulate all oral health professions in the public interest equally and fairly. So while I can't say what will end up happening, I certainly can say the at least intent at this point is there's going to be equal professional perspectives on the board. It's not going to be like 5 dentists, 1 dental hygienist, 1 dental tech, 1 dental denturist, and some public members. Initially, the discussions have been there'll be 1 professional member from each domain, including dental therapists and CDAs, and then an equal number of public members. That would get us to about 12. So I want to make it absolutely clear that A, nothing's changing yet. This process, should it move forward, would be lengthy. There will be lots of opportunity for dialogue and information sharing, and stay tuned. Until then, we are going to live up to our mission statement and regulate the profession of dental hygiene in the interest of the public and be collaborative with our other dental colleges as well as the other 13 colleges. In terms of those 13 colleges into one, I don't know what's going to happen with that. There was lots of feedback that was given that that may be too many. There is also feedback that why don't we just have 1 super regulator, that we go from 20 to 1. So stay tuned. There also will be the creation of the new oversight body. So you remember me mentioning right now there's the Health Profession Review Board. Their only mandate right now is to review decisions around registration and inquiry. They don't truly provide oversight to the regulator. So really this will be the regulator of the regulators. They'll set things like performance standards for the regulator. So how do we know that the regulator, the college, is doing a good job? They will audit against those standards and publish those reports. They will review decisions, much like the review board is doing now, but they will review decisions of the college related to registration and inquiry. They will develop a shared code of ethics for all regulated health professionals. So there's 1 shared code, which to me makes sense. I mean, ethics are ethics, regardless of what area you practice in. They will establish model bylaws. There's a bit of a model already, but they will have this kind of prescribed model for all of the regulators. They will be the one making the appointments. So you remember me talking about fully appointed boards. They will be the one doing that work. They will also establish a single register. So all the colleges will feed their registers into the oversight body so that a member of the public can literally type in a name and find out who that is instead of having the member of the public try to figure out what practice they were in and going to each individual college to figure it out. It's not as big of a deal, probably in sort of the dental arena, but can you imagine being in a hospital setting where you may see 5 different people in the space of a couple of hours, and if you're also ill, you're not going to remember, was that the OT, the nurse, the physician? You're not going to know. Maybe you'll remember their name, but you might not know which college you need to go to. So I actually do think this will be helpful for the public. And then lastly, there will change the complaints and adjudication process, the disciplinary process. They are intending to simplify the process to make it more easily understood by the public. They want the discipline process to be independent. So the inquiry functions, the investigative functions, that will remain at the regulator. But should a need for a discipline hearing occur, that will then, the citation will be issued by the college, but then the new oversight body will take on the discipline process. They're going to restructure the inquiry committee. They don't want any board members on the inquiry committee anymore right now. The statute actually requires us to have 1 elected board member and 1 publicly appointed board member on each of our statutory committees. They want to move that requirement for inquiry. All actions to be published. This is an interesting one because right now, if a consent order is signed, it's not necessarily published unless it's a serious matter. And there's some debate about whether it's a good thing for the public or not to publish all actions, because that might hamstring our ability to actually work with the practitioner to remediate if their name's going to be published anyways. It might lead to a much more adversarial approach to inquiry versus a remedial approach to inquiry. So it'll be interesting to see where they land on that. Consideration of prior complaints in the complaint process. changed the time limits. I'm not going to get into that, but there's a whole bunch of time limits in the Act about when we have to finish investigations by, which are very artificial and don't typically work very well. So what are the next steps? Well, the feedback on the consultation paper ended on January 10th. Hopefully you saw emails. We did send emails to our registrants, informing them of when the report was released and informing them of the deadline to end for the feedback. So hopefully some of you put feedback. And then we're just waiting. We're waiting for the committee to review that feedback. Apparently they got 700 pieces of written feedback and about 3,000 responses to the survey. So significant. All right, I will pause there for questions, comments. I see Mike. Yep, Mike.
Hi.
Hello.
The oversight
body.
Body.
Yep, the regulator of the regulators. Yep.
Who will be appointing that? How will that body come into existence?
Good question. That was not clear in the consultation paper, and funny enough, that was one of our pieces of feedback of who's actually now going to create this body. I'm assuming it's going to be the minister and the Ministry of Health that will hire the CEO and provide direction to this oversight body, but that was not abundantly clear in the paper.
Okay, my second question to you is seeing that they're reducing it from 20 to 5.
Yes.
With 8 to 12 board members.
Yep.
And our 4 colleges are going to be put into 1.
Correct.
Which means that 4 of our practices are actually going to take up 4 seats out of the 12.
Right, but don't forget CDSBC also regulates dental therapists and CDAs. So dental hygiene, dentist, dental tech, denturist, dental therapist, CDA. 6 public members, 12.
And how many registrants are in all those 6 colleges? Thousands?
I did the math, and I believe by the time we add everything together, we're about 15,000.
So 6 people are going to represent 15,000.
It's not about representing, though, right? It's about professional perspective on the board that's governing in the public interest. So it's not about, and that's the model we really want to try to get away with. It's not about representation. It's about making sure that there's the clinical or professional perspective on the board to inform those choices. But at the end of the day, the choice is to make a decision in the public interest. So theoretically, it shouldn't matter how many professionals you have on the board as long as the perspective is present to inform that. Because when you think about the board, the governing board is like 30,000 feet, right? They don't dive down into the weeds. There's working committees, statutory committees that do that, where probably even professional perspective would be even more important. But the board is a very high-level governing board. Okay. There's actually been discussions that professional perspective on a governing board isn't needed at all, but we won't go there.
No. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a question. Since if they're putting them into 5, all into 1, so our board essentially gets dissolved and they kind of pick one person from that entire College of Dental Hygiene to go and represent us. Is that essentially what
they're not going to be representing you. They're going to provide professional clinical perspective on the board. And I would think that the oversight body would be selecting the new board of the Oral Health College. I don't think it's going to be a situation where each college gets to send one person. But again, this is very early stages, so stay tuned.
Okay, so my extra question on this is, will we all dentists, CDAs, hygienists, or are we all going to have the same continuing education competencies required? The dentists need 90 in 3 days. We need 75 in 5 years. I think the dental assistants need 36 in 3 years. How are they going to amalgamate all that? Like, is it going to be everybody's got this much?
Just because you're regulated under one body doesn't mean you're regulated the same. There's a difference between being regulated under one body that has one office and one budget and one board. It doesn't mean that each profession is going to be regulated the same. The nurse practitioners don't have the same set of requirements as registered nurses, for example. So let's be clear, this is a regulatory structure. It is not a we're going to change how professions operate structure.
Oh, so dentists aren't going to need a QAP like we do.
Well, let's not get crazy, but my dream is, who's worked in this field for many, many years, is that we're going to be able to take the best of what everyone has to offer and find a new reality that actually can genuinely perform best practices in regulation. So we all have something to bring to the table. We all do some things really well, maybe not so much the other. So let's take the best practices from all 4 colleges and make one awesome oral health college.
Sorry, my question's pretty much similar or follows on with the QAP because I had the joy of going through that again this year. And about 7 or 8 years ago, you stood on one of these stages and said that this is to bring it in line with the Healthcare Professions Act. In the last little chunk of time, again, I've spoken to vets, chiros, physios, doctors, family doctors, CDAs, surgeons, massage therapists, dentists, LPNs, and RNs. And none of those people who have been in this Health Act for a lot longer than us have to take this crap. I had to spend like $1,000 to do this. It stresses me out right now just talking about the damn thing. There's 2 people in my office who had to do this. They're freaked out. You're going to work, freaking out about all this stuff. I understand. I have no problem with the QAP as a whole. Hey, this is where you need to improve on. This is where you do your stuff.
Right.
I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
The pass and fail part, I have an issue with.
Okay, so no one's license has ever been taken away because they were unsuccessful twice at the QAP. Number 1. In fact, all those people that you see on the bottom line, so what do we got? 2, 3, 4, 8, 10, 12, 14. 14 registrants in a period of 7 years have been unsuccessful twice on the QAP tool and have gone through the assessor process. I can tell you probably all but 2 who left practice for other reasons have actually thanked the college at the end because for whatever reason, their standards slipped below the bar and they were scared, they didn't know what to do, they didn't know where to go, and the college worked with them and supported them to get their standards to an acceptable level before they had a complaint made and their license taken away by discipline. So I would argue that while I understand regulatory requirements are uncomfortable and stressful, our job here is to make sure that the public receives safe care. And I don't want to get into a back and forth with you about who has QAP and who doesn't, but I'm not sure what you're being told, but I know for a fact that all those professions you listed have a QAP. Each profession is allowed to design their QAP the way they think is best suited to their profession. Some professions go through a 360 review where they have to collect reviews of all of their colleagues and have that combined to direct their learning. We went for a more individualized approach where a registrant can take it within a 2-month period in a setting they're comfortable in and get their results. So there is definitely pluses and minuses to all the models out there, but with a few exceptions, all health professions under the Act have a model of QAP.
I just wanted to comment on the proposed structure of the one college, oral health college. My experience on 2 boards was that the best decisions came from a diversity of perspectives and of perspectives that were well informed from a variety of practice settings, but also a variety of levels within administration, research, education, private practice, independent practice, public health, mobile outreach. So I'm really kind of questioning how one dental hygienist selected and appointed by the board might be able to provide that diversity, and therefore we would be relying on the perspectives of the other dental reps as well as the public reps to help inform decisions about dental hygiene regulation and bylaws and such. And so my experience on boards was that we always made the best decisions by really listening to the input of all the board members around the table that had so many different experiences and perspectives that I'm really questioning how it's going to be possible to have good decisions, because we know that decisions often come with time intensive. They don't necessarily have the time to get broader input. We know that there's a limitation by the college historically to be able to be doing a lot of gathering data from registrants on time, you know, day-to-day business. Certainly when there's big issues coming up, we have seen some surveys going out via BCDHA. But from a day-to-day operations, the decision-making is going to have to happen. Otherwise, we're going to see very slowed, you know, administrative processes. So I'm just questioning how the decision-making will go, because I'm thinking of all the dental hygienists in this province that hold leadership roles, and who do we really feel, from the people that I'm even thinking of in my own mind, could really effectively want to take that job and feel responsible for making decisions that cross the boundaries of so many areas of practice of which they may not be informed.
Okay, so let's be clear, a board at this level doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of practice, right? So it wouldn't be an expectation that that one dental hygienist would be knowledgeable about all levels of practice. And there's nothing that precludes a board from requesting expert input, from bringing in outside input. And I think also the thing is, let's not, you know, worry that literally there's going to be one dental hygienist on this oral health college board and no dental hygienists, you know, on the committees, in the staff, all those types of things. So I think that it is possible, and again, don't shoot the messenger, because this is not going to be my decision or our board's decision to make ultimately at the end of the day. But in my experience with governance, it is absolutely possible to have a well-functioning, high-level board that doesn't get into the weeds with those various perspectives. And let's be clear, there's going to be one dentist, one dental hygienist. It's not going to, the reverse is now true, right? Right now we have 4 colleges that have a number of their professional members on the board, usually more than 50%, and potentially giving the opportunity to work at cross purposes across the dental team. I mean, let's be fair, there was a review of the CDSBC governance because they had 6 dentists on the board governing in the dentist's interest, and that spills out onto how the dental team works together. If we can find a model where there is equal voices around the table, a model that allows the expertise to come in a consultative manner versus I'm going to decide and be the expert here only for fill in the blank, I think that actually will result in better collaborative practice. But again, I'm just the messenger. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think there is ways to make it work, to make it not potentially as scary as maybe it seems. Okay, we did touch on the quality assurance program slightly. I know we're kind of getting, well, actually we're doing pretty well. So that's good. I do want to just briefly touch on where we're at. You can see the trend is holding. People are doing very well on the QA tool. We did release the redesigned OLP software this past September. Hopefully that has made it an easier process to navigate and log your continuing education credits and set your goals and things like that. It should scale to phones and all that good stuff. So hopefully that is working well. And like I said, the low numbers, I think, is also a testament to the level of safety, currency, and competency within our registrant base. And while I don't have any data to tie these 2 things together, but I would like to think this data helped as we were having discussions with government about the removal of the 365 and the dentist on site. We could point to data to say our registrants are safe. And we're actually holding them to this level, perhaps unlike others. So I'm just going to wrap up the presentation with just a quick overview of inquiry and discipline for the last year. So these are stats from basically the prior year. We just ended our fiscal year in February. So we had 14 new complaints plus 2 cases carried over from the prior year. 3 of those complaints were dismissed without investigation because they were not under the college's purview. Most were related to employment type issues, which is not a regulatory matter. In 2 cases, no further action was taken. So basically, an investigation occurred, but no wrongdoing was found. There was 1 undertaking, which is basically a commitment not to repeat the action. 4 consent orders were signed, which are basically a statement of fact of what had happened and a list of requirements for the registrant to complete to ensure that the conduct doesn't happen again. This year, or I guess technically last year, we issued 2 citations for discipline. So you may recall in prior presentations, I've talked about 1 discipline hearing that happened, I believe, 2 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago now. This year, we're having 2. So that's doubling our 1. 2 cases, so because if you add those numbers up, it doesn't get to 16, it gets to 15. 2 cases were joined for 1 citation regarding the same registrant. So one of the citations was issued for a Pavle Djordjevic. Hopefully I'm not completely messing that up. That hearing took place on February 18th, 2020 in Vancouver. We are just awaiting the discipline panel's decision. This individual was also suspended from practice due to not complying with the investigation and also not maintaining contact with the college. I rarely do this, but I'm going to say, if you know Mr. Djordjevic and you know his whereabouts, either encourage him to come into contact with us or please come and talk to me. We can't reach him and it's a problem. And the second citation is issued for Keisha Corbett. Her hearing is scheduled for April 23rd and 24th, 2020 in Vancouver. Both copies of citations can be found on our website. And so obviously we're very busy doing that as well. This is not the most pleasant part of our role, but it is an important role that we take action when we discover unethical or incompetent practice. And it obviously benefits the public, but it is also important for the profession that the bad actors are addressed. If you don't already follow us on Facebook, follow us on Facebook. We also have a YouTube channel where this video will be posted, as well as videos from prior years. Oh, there you go. Any last questions about anything I've talked about? Anything I haven't talked about? All right, well, I can see everyone's exiting to grab lunch. So thank you for hanging in. Thank you for attending. Have a great conference.